What if I told you photography was actually easy once you learn these 3 easy steps? If you don't know who I am, I'm Cameron. I'm a portrait and wedding photographer based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. In today's video, I'm basically going to teach you photography in all of 5 to 10 minutes. After this, you're going to become a master and you're going to make a lot of money. That's a lie. That's a lie. But I am going to help you learn what is called the exposure triangle. Now, what is the exposure triangle? It is made up of 3 components. It is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And all these play a part in how your final image is going to look, whether it's underexposed, whether it's properly exposed, or whether it is overexposed. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is your shutter speed. Your shutter speed is going to be the number on the bottom left-hand corner of your camera screen, and it's going to look like a fraction. So it's probably going to say 1/100 or 1/200, so on and so forth. Typically, this goes all the way up to 1/8000 and all the way down to actually bulb mode. And that's another story for another time because that's just going to confuse you. So your shutter speed is going to affect how long your shutter stays open, and it's also going to affect how bright or dark your image is because it's allowing light into your sensor. So with that being said, if your camera is 1/5, your shutter speed is going to stay open a lot longer. It's going to allow a lot more light into your image, and then your image is going to be a lot brighter. On top of that, a 1/5 shutter speed means there's going to be a lot of motion blur in your image as well. So if you want less motion blur, you're going to up your shutter speed. So the higher your shutter speed goes, the less motion blur is going to be in your final image, but also the darker your image will get because it will shorten the amount of time that your shutter's open, which means a lot less light is going to be entering your camera sensor. A good rule of thumb is to match your shutter speed with your focal length. So if you're using an 85mm, you don't want to go lower than 1/80. And then if you're using like a 7200, the lowest you want to go is 1/70 or 1/200, depending on which focal length you're at. The way I personally like to do it, and I didn't do it this way right off the bat, but now that I understand it, this is the way I like to do it. If I'm shooting anything remotely moving, I'm at 1/250 and I don't go any lower unless I absolutely have to. I do that because I don't always have the steadiest hand, so I know that at 1/250, even if I'm shaking just a little bit, it's quick enough, the shutter's fast enough to where I'm not getting any motion blur in my images. So just remember that the lower the shutter speed, the more motion blur and also the more light is going to be in your image. The higher the shutter speed, the darker the image and the less motion blur you're going to get. All right. So next we're going to talk about in the exposure triangle is your aperture. Your aperture is going to determine your depth of field. So if you ever looked at an image and you're like, whoa, the subject looks super separated from the background or the background's super blurry, that comes from a low aperture. So when you look at the aperture in your lens, it's going to be a middle number. It's going to be a decimal. So like 2.8 or 2.5 or 3.2. That number is going to determine your depth of field. So the lower it goes, the more shallow in focus your image is going to be, or the less depth of field you're going to have. And the higher that number, the more depth of field you're going to have, or the more in focus your subject and your image is going to be. On top of that, the lower the number of the aperture, the more light is going to enter your camera sensor, therefore creating a brighter final image. And the higher the aperture, the less light is going to enter your camera sensor and the darker your final image is going to be. You kind of see how this is working so far. Now, aperture is kind of unique because it all depends on what type of lens you're using. So if you're trying to go down to a 2.8 aperture and you're like, why doesn't my lens go down to 2.8? It only goes down to 4.5. Your lens will tell you what aperture you can shoot at. So some lenses have like a 4.5 to 6.3 or 4.5-6.3. And some lenses have only one number, like a 2 or a 1.2 or 2.8. That just means that that's the aperture, that's the lowest aperture that you can go. So if you're using a lens and all it says is 1.2, the lowest aperture you can go to is 1.2, which means you can get a lot of light into your camera sensor. Now, if you're using a zoom lens, there is a chance that you're gonna have that dash like a 4.5 to 6.3. That's what we call a variable aperture. So say you're using a 24-70 and your aperture is 4.5 to 6.3. That's gonna mean that at the widest focal length of 24, your aperture is gonna be able to go down all the way to 4.5. And then as you zoom out all the way to 70, the lowest aperture you're going to be able to get to is 6.3. Now, in my opinion, those lenses are kind of frustrating because you're going to have to play with all the other settings in your exposure triangle, because if you're zooming out and trying to get a tight shot at 70, you're going to have to adjust your shutter speed and ISO, which we're going to talk about next, in order to get the properly exposed image that you're looking for. So to put it this way, if you like how portrait mode looks on your iPhone, you're going to want a low aperture lens. If you want more things to be in focus, then you're going to have to increase your aperture until you get the image that you're looking for. The next thing we're going to talk about in the exposure triangle is your ISO. Your ISO is basically your camera sensor sensitivity to light. So the lower your ISO on your camera, the less sensitive it's going to be. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive to light your sensor is going to be. You may hear some people say keep your ISO as low as possible when shooting. Well, that, you know, I see the vision on that. That's not entirely true, because that's not always going to be an image that you're looking for. So basically a low ISO is a low sensitivity to light, and you're going to want to use a low ISO if you're in like a bright, let's say you're outside and you're in full sun. You're gonna want a low ISO, because raising your ISO is just gonna blow out your image. If you're in a low light situation, you may have to increase your ISO to increase the sensor sensitivity to light so you can get the proper image that you're wanting. So basically for ISO, if you're outdoors in a very bright setting, your ISO is probably going to be as low as possible. And then if you're like nighttime indoors, then you're going to have to raise your ISO until you get the exposure that you want. Now, me personally, how would I navigate this exposure triangle to get correct exposure every single time? Well, I would start off with my aperture, because I want to determine what type of depth of field do I want before I worry about the shutter speed or the ISO. So if I'm taking a portrait and let's say I want to shoot at 2.8, then I'm going to start at 2.8 and then I'm going to go to the left and go to my shutter speed. Then I'm going to want to say, okay, do I want less motion blur or do I want more motion blur? Am I doing a moving subject or a standstill subject? What's my focal length? These are kind of the things that I'm going to think about when I'm talking about my shutter speed. So let's say I want a shallow depth of field at 2.8, and then I'm taking pictures of a walking subject, like a subject is walking towards me. I'm probably going to go at 250. That's kind of where my baseline is. Someone's walking towards me, I want less motion blur, but they're not running, so I don't need to go to like 1000 or 2000 shutter speed. I'm going to go to 250 so I can freeze that action and I'm not getting a lot of motion blur. And then I'm going to want to talk about, you know, ISO after that. But 250 is usually the baseline to where if I'm shooting a slow moving subject or moving subject at all, sometimes if I'm shooting a still subject, I'm still at 250, but that's just me personally. Then, you know, I know that's a baseline to where I'm not going to get any motion blur and I'm going to get a tack sharp image. After I set my shutter speed, I'm going to go to the ISO. So if I'm in a bright environment, I'm not going to have to worry about the ISO because I can keep it at 100 because I'm still going to get the image that I want. If I'm in a low light or dim lit situation like indoors, I'm probably going to have to up my ISO to get proper exposure because I'm already at 250 shutter speed. I'm already at 2.8 aperture, and these are the settings that I don't want to touch. So then I'm going to the ISO and I'm adjusting that until I get the image that I want. Now, what happens if you're outside in full sun and you're at 250 shutter speed and 2.8 aperture and you're at 100 ISO and you're like, well, my image is still, you know, too bright. I can't see my subject. Then at that point, you still want to keep that shallow depth of field. You still want to keep that ISO as low as possible because you're outside and you don't need it. So at that point, you will up your shutter speed. Even though it's kind of overkill, it's still what you need to do to make sure you have a properly exposed image. So then you need to play with maybe 1/500 or 1/1000. The shutter speed is going to vary depending on the type of situation you're in. Now, hopefully this video is going to tell you or teach you not to ask anybody anymore, hey, what settings should I use for this? Because it we don't know. Like, nobody's gonna know. Depending on your situation is going to be what settings you need to use. And that's why the exposure triangle is so useful and so needed. And you need to know exposure triangle because you need to know how to navigate these settings and depending in certain situations in order to get the final image that you want. Like, I can't say, hey, when you go outside at 5 o'clock, go to 200 shutter speed and 2.8 aperture and 100 ISO, and then in your neck of the woods it's dark outside and you're like, well, these settings didn't work because it's dark outside. Well, it's like, well, did you adjust? And it's like, no, that's what you told me to do. It's a mess. Okay, so that's why you need to learn your exposure triangle. So to recap, shutter speed is going to be the lower your shutter speed is, the more light is going to enter your camera sensor. and the more motion blur you're going to have, the higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you're going to have, and the darker your image is going to be. Aperture, the lower the number of your aperture, the more shallow your depth of field is going to be. The higher your aperture, the more depth of field you're going to get. ISO, the lower your ISO, the less sensitive your camera sensor is going to be to light. The higher ISO, the more sensitive your camera sensor is going to be to light. And now that you have this information, you just need to go out and shoot and play with it. And like I said, me personally, I set my aperture first. Do I want to shallow the field, or do I want a lot of stuff in focus? And then from there, I go to my shutter speed. And then from there, I go to my ISO. And that's how I learned, and that's how I did it, and that's how I still do it to this day, and this is what works for me. So with that being said, I hope this video helped some of you who are just getting started in photography and still trying to understand like manual mode, and hopefully this video helps you get out of auto and help you get started into manual mode. With that being said, like and subscribe to the channel. There'll be more information and videos like this where this came from, and I'm gonna holler at y'all next time. Peace.